vampires are now known as one of the most prevalent folktales of our times. The creature's mythology has changed drastically through the centuries since its first iterations, being documented in the 1700s, written into classic tales such as Bram Stoker's 1897 Dracula, and up to the recent over-romanticized 2005 Stephenie Meyer novel, Twilight. The success of vampire legend has allowed it to continue to be told, retold, and changed throughout history, whilst retaining a few attributes originally linked to them. In this video, we take a look through the history of vampire legend and our top 5 instances of vampirism. Let's begin. Number 5. EuroGrando. EuroGrando is said to be the first ever recorded person to be known as a vampire, and the stories and documents come from a village in what is now known as modern-day Croatia. The legend says that after his death in 1656, he came back from the grave and terrorized the village until his decapitation by the villagers in 1672. He would knock on doors around the village, and whichever house was called on, a member of the household would die in the next few days. A group of villagers were eventually gathered to dig up Euro's coffin, only to find a perfectly preserved corpse with a smile on its face. They attempted to stake the body to the casket, but failed, opting instead to saw off the head, and once the remains had been desecrated, the nightly house calls and unexplained deaths ended. Number 4. Peter Blagojevich. In the early 1700s, reports of vampirism began gathering momentum, with cases being reported in public newspapers and the topic often discussed in everyday conversation. In regard to these increased reports, one of the first concerned Peter Blagojevich from Serbia. After his death in 1725, it is said that he returned from the grave and killed 9 of his villagers. It should be noted that people witnessed the staking of his body in an attempt to end the alleged attacks, which did not succeed. The stories say that a full week after Peter's grave was desecrated to end the killing spree, 9 other villagers were found dead in their beds, with people claiming they witnessed his deathly visage throughout the night. Peter's wife also claimed that after his death, he returned home and brutally murdered his son, biting into his neck and draining his body of blood. Number 3. Arnold Powell. Shortly after the aforementioned events in 1725, Arnold Powell was killed the following year and was to become a second documented case of vampirism in another Serbian village named Ottoman. Arnold was said to have killed 16 of his fellow villagers after rising from his grave. The stories state that Arnold settled in the village whilst travelling, and it was common knowledge among the residents that he would say that he had been plagued by a vampire during his time on the move. Arnold died from a broken neck after a fall, and as with the previous events listed in this video, after his death, 4 people reported seeing him in the streets. All had died shortly after. Some members of the local authorities took on the case, saying they had experienced these events before. This was claimed to be the case of Peter Blagojevich, and stated that the grave must be exhumed. The corpse was showing no signs of decomposition, and the report states that they found fresh blood had flowed from his eyes, nose, mouth, and ears, that the shirt, the casket lining, and the coffin were caked in blood, and that the old nails on his hands and feet had fallen off and that new ones had grown. They staked Arnold, and the corpse supposedly reacted by groaning until dying a second time. Number 2. Malika Stannah. 5 years after the second Serbian case in 1726, further instances occurred following the same trends in and around neighbouring villages. 2 documented reports both mentioned large groups of people dying in settlements, all at different ages and within a short time period, counting around 17 deaths within months. In the report, it was found that the deaths were related and all seemed to point towards 2 new people who had joined the village, Malika and Stannah. After an investigation, it was found they had both come from the Ottoman village 5 years prior. Malika was found to have eaten meat which was killed and apparently tainted by Arnold before his death, and Stannah admitted to have smeared alleged vampire blood on herself as a form of protection after the events had taken place, which was thought to have turned both the women after death. Surgeons on the case reported all the bodies were in vampiric conditions, likely matching the descriptions of the previous bodies linked to vampire attacks, and once the investigation was completed, the heads were removed and both bodies were burned. This is a notable instance showing the vampire myth spreading between settlements, as it shows the direct involvement of authorities and the documentation by physicians and officers who added to the legend by confirming the existence of such creatures. Number 1. Mercy Brown. The timeline now brings us to 1892. Since the past events, there have been many writings concerning the ever-increasingly popular topic of vampirism, including the 1748 German poem The Vampire by Heinrich Ossenfelder, and the first commercially successful story containing elements of vampirism, also named The Vampire, by John William Polidori in 1819. But it is said that the case of Mercy Brown would be the loose inspiration for the character Lucy in Bram Stoker's classic Dracula, which was published 5 years later. The Brown family had fallen victim to the most prevalent disease at the time, tuberculosis. Through the years, each member of the family grew sick and passed away. First the mother and the eldest daughter in 1888, then Mercy in 1890, followed by the son in 1891. Due to so many deaths in the family, some neighbors and relatives suspected the tales of vampirism had landed within the family, and asked the father if they could exhume the bodies. The exhumation of the bodies were documented and published in newspapers in 1892. All bodies of the family had naturally decomposed over the years, except Mercy Brown, whose body was unchanged and was found to have blood remaining inside several vital organs. This was seen to be confirmation of her vampiric nature, and so her heart was removed and her body was burned. At this time, the son was still suffering the effects of the disease, and was forced to drink a mixture of water and her sister's ashes in an attempt to cure him. He passed away 2 months later. So there you have it. That was our top 5 list of historic vampire cases. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Check back again for our next video on the top 5 list of terrifying clown stories. Until next time.